That was yours, and I was just about to take it. Just start drinking it and just, hey, what you doing there, buddy?
Here's the thing I have an issue with when it comes to love language concept.
Tell me.
So I find them a little bit. I mean, maybe they probably would even agree that it's a little too cookie cutterish. It's like, yeah, there's these 5.
Well, actually,
It's
there's
like,
been an updated version that you'd probably appreciate that basically...
Self is the knowledge aspect, intimate knowledge. Because that's
Intimate knowledge, what do you mean?
Because that's genuinely, to me, none of the individual gifts mean anything unless they show a level of, like, I understand you.
Right.
Because that, to me, is where I'm like, I've put so much effort into understanding me that if anybody else was willing to put that equal amount of effort, I'd be like, hey, this is a person who cares. So the idea of, like, because I had this thought of, like, I'm not an active... No, I think quality time comes the closest because that's the only way in which you can gain such a thing.
Sure, yeah.
But because I'm thinking, like, okay, as I was thinking just now, I'm like, well, is acts of service the lowest? Because I actually feel like maybe gifts is the lowest, if only because...
Gifts
to me, gifts...
I
never quite know how to react to getting a gift because I'm like, I don't know.
Sorry, I'm still fussing with
the fact that gifts tend to make me somewhat more, and acts of service, honestly, genuinely, I also sort of feel a little bit awkward about it. Not in a sense
I don't know that I would use the word awkward, but I agree with you. I think for me, gifts feels too easy. I don't know. Maybe that's maybe you might agree with me more than let me explain. You might actually agree because I can think of a gift that, or I should say that gifts could go either way with me, which is how I know that I don't think it counts as its individual love language. It's like it only counts if it somehow redirects to my first, which is a gift that shows like, wow, you could never have known I would want this unless you knew me, because this is such a strangely specific thing. Sure.
And any gift that isn't that, I'm like, okay, again, I respect that you put the effort and the money into this, and I honor it because I think it's, it's a kind act of you. But like, if it doesn't show a deeper level of like, hey, I knew that you would like this, even though it's totally out of the blue, then it doesn't touch me personally.
Sure.
And in the same way, an act of service, I'm like, I'm not, unless it was a very specific act that's like, hey, I know you well enough to know that this is what you need in this moment. In which case, then it's not really the act, it's the knowledge underneath that matters. So that's where I go, if I could say one that I think is the most significant, it's like just...
acts of knowledge.
Well, I mean... Again, quality time, I think, is the closest because only through quality time can you gain this.
Let's qualify. So there's acts of service,
which is the 5 of them,
gifts,
physical touch.
Yeah, but
I'm heavy in that just because I'm a man.
Yeah, I was about to say that one. I feel like is kind of a throwaway. I mean,
no, because I also think, again, if you come up and are just like, you're physical touch, so here's a hug, I'm going to feel like that's formulaic. I'm going to notice that you're doing that. But if it is a genuine like...
isn't everybody physical touch to a degree, and also isn't everybody really. Not physical touch to a degree? Because I'm like, if you only ever touch someone,
there's people who it's like who are just sort of huggy.
Your hands on
there's that kind of people. It's like, he's a hugger. So
those people off put me.
Well, yeah. Well, but see, to me,
there was one person.
The reason they off put me is actually because it's an act. It is actually, in my opinion, a transgression of boundary, not. Oh, I'm just uncomfortable with physical touch. It's like, no, I like physical touch from a very small group of people. You are not in that group, so please back away. But even then, there's an element of, and I suppose perhaps this will seem hypocritical because I was saying it's, I don't agree with the idea of you should know that I want it rather than, rather than me having to tell you. But there's an element of physical touch
is different,
spontaneous physical touch, which is just, I'm genuinely excited about being near you. So it's like, hey, I'm happy to see you, so this is a natural hug, not, I know your love language is hug, so I'm going to give you a hug.
Hey, I'm happy to see you. I see you're happy to see me.
Well, let's be frank. I freaking love it, Kathleen. There's an element of like, this is in fact what they say is like one of the things that people think, all men want in a marriage is just regular sex. It's like, not if they're the ones feeling like I have to instigate and you don't even care. Truth. It's like, no, is genuine. It's like you wanting physical affection from me is actually in some ways more valuable than me than you simply assenting when I want it.
Yeah, 100%.
And again, maybe that comes into the like, well, you have to want it and not just know that I want it. That's maybe unfair.
But no, I to your point though.
But even then, that goes to an element of that show. I guess maybe it's not necessarily the knowledge as much as it is genuine
understanding.
Because I was going to say interest, and I was like, well, interest isn't deep enough. Genuine interest in understanding, I suppose. Where it's like, you are a complex thing that I want to know, not just.
Well, it's the way you pursue life too on your. Because you could say, level.
Well, technically, any of these would show that they're interested in you because they're doing something.
Sure.
I'm just like. That's why it has to be a genuine interest in understanding, where it's like. Well, because isn't it? I mean, we're going to get weirdly metaphysical, but it's like when you think about the objects that exist, the human mind is easily like the weirdest one that does exist ever anywhere.
It's one of the most well.
It's like even neurologically, certainly. There's something to say that it's like there's more synapses in your brain than stars in the universe.
Yes.
So it's like it is the most complex physical object that exists as a human brain, and therefore it's the human mind. And that opens up the whole can of worms of where's the dividing line between the brain and the mind. But even then, it's like, okay, if the brain is the most complicated thing, then probably the mind is too. Or they share the same complexity, to which I go, that
I would say there's a greater complexity to the mind because it also has...
But I mean, yeah. But so that's where I go. If someone were to say, I find the sort of microcosm of oddness that is you... so fascinating that I want to understand it.
Right.
That means more than any of these other things. And these other things will only mean something if they reflect that. That says, hey, I have gained such an understanding of you that I know that in this moment, this action will mean something, or this gift means something.
Correct.
Or because I want to know you so well, I want to spend the time with you that is required to get you to know.
Well, and that's part of the knowing the...
Let's call it existential intimacy. How about that?
Sure. No, I think that's fair. I was going to clarify. I think you were saying you were almost coming off as a bit hypocritical. I think I'm going to slightly defend you in that there's a difference between saying you are obligated to understand what I am expecting from you versus you know this about me and are doing this as a expression or a gift or a something, but that's not something you're expecting. That's the difference. You're not sitting there going, if they don't do this, it's wrong.
No, and there's an element.
That's the dividing line.
In some ways, I admit that there is probably an element of this. There's an element that this is precisely what often is meant when people say you have chemistry. It's like, not to say that if your love languages don't align, you won't have chemistry, but like probably if you really like someone, it's because you share love languages, in my opinion, or at least because I tend to think about these things, this would be something I think about going into a relationship is what's yours? Is it like mine? Are we going to...
What's yours? Is it like
Are we going to have chemistry where I'm not... And again, it's not to say that it's cheap if we're like, oh, are we going to have to jump through hoops to meet each other's love languages? Because that's not always just because you have to do that doesn't invalidate it.
It's complicated though, because like,
but I think you'd be happier with someone who shares your love language in the same way that I am very much of the opinion. Many people would call this reductionist.
Yeah, reductionist.
That I am. I would totally say there are services that do this. None of them have quite seemed to be.
What services?
None of them have seemed to be quite like. I don't know what the word is. They don't have their science well enough baked down. But I would totally be up for like a personality type based dating kind of thing.
Sure.
Where it's like, oh, take this sort of spate of the most common tests and the profiles would be based on that. I know that such things exist, but none of them have seemed to really none of them have seemed as professional or like they seem very much like we're all folk psychologists. Yeah. It's like, yeah, we've taken the test ourselves. Or it's like, no, I would want genuinely like it's essentially like a dating service that says take this actual accredited test and then you'll be paired with people who are similar, because I genuinely think there are elements that I would say, yes, this is an element that I lack in my own personality. So having someone who balances it would be a good idea and would actually probably lead to some degree of, because you obviously don't necessarily want to date just a clone of yourself. That would be also kind of stifling in weird ways. But like, there are elements which I think this is something that I would be open to someone who's different because I recognize my deficiency in this area. And then there's some things that are like, no, this is actually core to the way I look at the world. So dealing with someone who doesn't look at the world this way is going to actually cause conflict more than it is going to help.
Well, that's
so
on
I'm
a
a little
value level.
So in the same sense that I would say that.
But chemistry is such a complicated thing, and this is where I get into a bit of the.
What are you talking about, chemistry?
No, but I'm just saying you kind of related it to chemistry, and I.
Oh, you're saying okay? So you mean? I thought you were actually. I thought you were somehow going to the actual science of chemistry.
No, but I'm saying chemistry, like relational chemistry.
There has to be enough similarities and enough differences, and they need to be in tune.
Yeah,
because this idea of like, opposites attract. Well, it's like, well, not total opposites.
Yeah, 100%. And tune is a very good key because there's a part of it that. Oh man, how do I describe this? You know, again, in studying some of the kind of and I got into this in one of the previous episodes, but I believe I was kind of in and out of consciousness, so I don't remember exactly. No, but the notion of you know, when I was studying body language and becoming, what did you call it? The weird Dune people?
Oh, Bene Gesserit.
Bene Gesserits. But, you know, the notion that chemistry sometimes is instantaneous, where you can go, okay, well, I meet somebody.
This is how
other times where it's develops over time.
I have very rarely made friends that were not instant. Like, oh, wow, that guy's kind of cool.
But sometimes it is just a time-based thing where it's like, okay.
No, I disagree. I have never had a really long-lasting friendship that was like, yeah, I met him this time ago, and we sort of were around, and then, you know, we were together. We happened upon each other several times for years, and now we're friends. It's like, no, it's always been kind of like, oh, hey, we just kind of hit it off day one, because otherwise,
was that true for us?
Kind of.
I feel like it was.
I feel like it was, and I feel like any of the other friendships I have thought of, there was not much of a probationary like,
well, yeah, that's true.
We kind of got used to each other, and then. Because that's sort of, in some ways, what high school friendships are often like. It's like, yeah, I saw you 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 4 years.
Now I think I may want
Chances are. No. Yeah, it's like, and that's not to say that those are any less valid friendships.
No, they're less valid.
No, okay, not on the face of it. They certainly can be, but I also think that they can also be genuine.
Sure.
For different reasons, because I think that's interesting because that is a period of your life when you are
developing yourself.
So other people who, it's a little bit like sort of combat friends where it's like we've seen each other in the most personally tumultuous situations, so that means we know each other very well.
Matter of fact, there was a video I watched the other day where I think a gunnery sergeant was meeting up with one of his, like, I can't remember what, it was part of his other platoon, but it was like one of his superior officers or whatever, and he surprised him, and he had like done this thing where his family knew that he was coming, and so the guy answers the door and literally probably takes a good 5 seconds just staring at him, and then they just give each other a hug, but it's like a long, like, he's crying into the guy's arms, and it's like, yeah, I mean, if you went through that, you probably would just be like, yes, someone who's here who, like, you know, because again, there's a difference in when you, it's a bit of the Joker speech that he gives in the scene where he's like talking about, you know, in their final moments, people show you who they really are. It's like in the lowest of low moments, people are going to be very. All masks are coming down.
Even then, I think it's several quotes. I believe one of them is even attributed to the Joker, although it's mostly a paraphrase of Oscar Wilde, where he says, "Give a man a mask and he'll tell you the truth." Mm-hmm. I believe Oscar Wilde said something like that, and then Joker has been quoted as saying something very similar in the comics. I'm not sure which version I just quoted, but it's basically the same quote almost, word for word. But it's kind of true. Mm-hmm. Where it's like when the expectation of continuity between your past and present selves limits your behavior when you're conscious of it, because you think,
no, that's good.
I may want to act this way, but everyone else will react poorly because this will be something that they're like, where did this come from? There's his Why the Stranger by Billy Joel is a really interesting song.
Yeah.
Because it says, he is not always evil and he is not always wrong. Where it's like, sometimes the stranger shows up, kicks you right between the eyes, but sometimes it's like, that doesn't mean that like, oh, this wasn't you. It's like, no, sometimes it is them. And sometimes it's not that he's not evil and it's not that he's wrong. Sometimes he's got a point. But it's I don't know, Billy Joel knew a lot about life.
I think that I had to get over that for not Billy Joel. No one can do that.
I can't get over. I'm still stuck on Billy Joel.
But the idea of having people be, there was a period of I think I expressed it this way to my wife, that there was like a grieving period where I literally almost had to put to death the former version of myself, in that people had to grieve me. Like, it was like there were people that literally would come up to me, why are you acting this way, or what's going on with this, or why are you kind of acting strangely, and they could not wrap their heads around the fact that I was no longer that person. And at one point, I literally had to say to one of them, I was like,
you didn't Taylor Swift them, did you?
What?
She can't come to the phone because she's dead?
No.
Okay, well, I was just hoping.
No.
I hope you didn't actually say that to them.
No. I said something to the effect of, that person, that version of me, literally does not exist. Like, I cannot go back to who I was before these events took place. That does not happen. And for a while, I almost felt like I had to be apologetic about it. And then I just got to the point that I was like, no, that's just, sorry. There is no going back. But I think I'm finally on the other side of it, in that there is now an appreciation for the differences, maybe now. But anywho, that's, yeah.
No, so
I had a thought.
I wanted to tack that on to from the last conversation, because I was thinking it in the gap when I was getting my drink.
In the gap. That's a good. That'll be the.
See, the problem I had
weird,
I had this idea that it would.
One that we have.
Well, I had this idea because the problem is
you just smell something weird.
No, I was trying to think about how to phrase because the whole idea of like standing in the gap, I think, is an interesting kind of image. But the problem is you couldn't turn that into like a brand very well, because the first thing that came to mind is like sort of.
Well, it was a brand.
No, okay, not just the word, but I'm saying specifically like that notion of, could you give a name for the? I mean, in some ways, it's sort of like a phrase as iconic as like "my brother's keeper," because that's essentially what that means. But that's saying someone who stands in the gap for others. But I was like, well, the only thing I came to mind first was like gap stander, and that sounds stupid.
Well,
he's a gap stander.
Arbitrator is what it is, but
no, because that has a negotiation concept where it's like, I am an external, like, okay, we're gonna make this official and we're gonna air grievances and I'm talking more of more brother's keeper is like, I've got your back in the trench, storm,
kind of, yeah.
But just gap stander sounds stupid, and I can't think of any other way. Of saying it that because everyone knows what it means to stand in the gap. But if you were to change the wording to make it sound less dumb, I think you'd get too far from the original phrase.
I think it's a shame.
Maybe you should just bring back the phrase "brother's keeper."
Well, I was about to say, I think it's a shame that Americans
or kinsman redeemer. I'm quite fond of.
Dropped the notion of like. I
kinsman redeemer. I agree.
No, I appreciate.
I should be able to kill someone just because he killed a member of my family accidentally.
Use that term mates for like brothers and friends, because I think we oftentimes, especially on a United States level, we attribute that like to a romantic thing. But I kind of appreciate the fact that mates is like a.
Oh, okay, like my yeah.
Like,
mate. That's awfully primal. I've never heard someone refer to their spouse as their mate before.
Sure, but
it's evocative in the, well, okay, but you'd have to add the qualifier.
Sure.
Because I'm not saying it wouldn't evoke the same message, but it does evoke it takes a kind of animalistic like.
It is, yeah.
And so I'm not sure that you'd immediately go for it.
Ooh.
But. Well, I am curious then what the etymology of it is in the British sense, because does it come from like a squad mate or a shipmate or a?
I don't know. I would imagine shipmate maybe, but But anyway,
Go back to calling everyone comrade.
okay. Funny enough, all of my Salvadorian guys that I work with, they call each other they call each other camara, which is just like comrade. It's like that's hilarious to me that they just like it's like amigo, but it's deeper.
But comrade is that which of the words is that stemming from? Because comrade is a Russian word, whereas camaraderie I think comes.
No, camarade is what they. It's literally.
But you
comrade.
You can't call it just because it's a false cognate.
No, but what I'm saying is it's the same thing. It like they're saying the same sentiment, which is like you're my comrade, you're my brother in arms kind of thing.
I don't know that brother in arms and comrade are specifically the same. I'm going to look up the etymology, except the internet probably is still out. Oh no, it seems to be back.
Yeah, no, it's okay right now.
All right, etymology of camaraderie.
Well, not camaraderie. It's
well, no, because I'm curious. Because comrade is a Russian word,
but is
camaraderie a derivation of that Russian word, or is it a false cognate?
I would imagine it is.
Not always. Sometimes languages develop similar words just because of randomness. Okay, the internet claims to work, but it isn't working well.
On another note, I thought
French, camarade.
Which makes sense because I.
Okay, well, where did the French get it? Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not a Russian word. Maybe the Russians got it from the French.
It sounds French.
Well, camarade, yes, but I'm saying comrade. I had thought that the word comrade was a Russian, like a Slavic origin word, but maybe it isn't. Because the Russians obviously borrowed words from Europe some of the time, so.
But so I have been listening to. I've been on a bit of a history kick recently.
It is okay.
What?
So it is in fact different words. I think this is at least sounding like it. Kamarad, the Russian word for. Oh, that's interesting. So it was a Russian translation of a Turkish word, which meant like someone you traveled with. So that does imply that it's a false cognate, that it's two languages developed a similar sounding word with similar meanings separately. Unless, I mean, the etymology I saw said it comes from French. Maybe the French got it from the Turks as well, but it would have said that, I thought, if it had. That does happen, though, so you can't always assume.
No, I just think it's funny because they do it. They have adopted that. But no, I've been on a bit of a history kick recently, and so I've been delving into a video podcast on YouTube that I think you might appreciate. And I'm going to make sure that I actually get his last name correctly, but it's Dan Carlin, and he's got all these great he's got a thing called Hardcore History. The one that I'm listening to,
they're thinking of a comedian.
No, he's not. He was a radio.
I'm thinking George Carlin.
Oh, maybe.
Am I thinking George Carlin? There is a comedian who is a bit of a, I don't know.
Bit of a loony.
Well, how is Carlin spelled?
It is.
I believe George Carlin's the comedian I'm thinking of, who's a bit of a weirdo.
It's Carl and then I-N. It's just Carlin.
Yeah, George Carlin's the comedian. Social critic is what he has very bizarre sort of opinions about society that I don't agree with. So Dan, I've not heard of this Dan fellow.
Dan Carlin, he does hardcore history, and these are like.
I feel like I might have heard of hardcore histories, but
I'm not exaggerating. These are deep dives into various parts of history. Like when he is very Tolkien-esque, if I could describe it that way.
You need to get on Lotus Eaters. They have a whole series dedicated to history.
In that he goes off on tangents intentionally, and when he sets up his podcast, he basically says, look, I'm walking down these tangents because you almost, when you're retelling history, you don't know necessarily where to start and where to...
True.
Right, exactly. And so he's trying to bring all this context or whatever, and right now I'm listening to the kind of around the Persians attacking what's the what is it called? Not Hell's Gate, but it was with the Spartan 300 and
Thermopylae.
Thermopylae. So but it's not strictly that. It's just kind of the Persian Empire and their kind of conquest and whatever else. And it literally is three.
This was another thing I sent you was the history of the Byzantine Empire.
It's 3
hours
series or no. It's 3 parts long, and each part is like 4 hours.
I might have heard this guy by reputation because the Lotus Eaters have referenced someone who they talk about as being this kind of thing.
He's amazing in the way he not only delineates just various tangents of history and things of that nature, but the way he communicates it is just remarkably gripping. And so anyway, as I have been walking through that, when he first opened his podcast, and I thought this would be an interesting topic for us to just touch on, you can get to what you sent me and ring.
Well, it was actually
hang another additional albatross.
It was just a similar thing. I'm not a huge follower, but I watched a video by, I think it's called Overly Sarcastic Productions, and so they're a little bit. They animate their discussions of history, so it's a little bit more
tongue in cheek.
A little. It's called Overly Sarcastic Productions for a start.
Yeah.
But so they had a whole hour-long video about the history of the Byzantine Empire, and they're just funny. So one of the screenshot I sent you was talking about the various crusades, and I forget which of them, but one of the crusades really sort of went off the rails because it was like, yeah, we're going to go reclaim the Palestine, and somehow we ended up in Byzantium. So we just started massacring a bunch of Orthodox Christians because they weren't Catholics. And so they were going through the various emperors, and so it was the emperor, I forget his name. It's probably in the picture, but it was just like it's this image of like this cartoon picture of the emperor. It just says, "Gentlemen, please, I assure you, Deus does not volt." And I don't know why the framing of that I just found to be an incredibly funny history joke.
No, it's he describes as he was unpacking kind of the purpose of his podcast. He said, "I literally started this with the notion of like, what if Alexander the Great had a podcast?" And he goes,
it's a touch narcissistic.
No, he wasn't comparing himself to he was basically
saying what would we have recorded?
Yeah, he said because the issue is in both oral history and then even within the
burning of Alexandria is a sad thing.
Well, but to think about
actually the library. This was in the Overly Sarcastic
within
one.
The actual scribe era, and you have all this written documentation, but then it gets reframed and
let's just be honest, most of it gets lost.
Right, it's either degraded because of age, it gets reframed
or just
because
destroyed,
or destroyed intentionally.
Because they actually this was in the Overly Sarcastic one. There's the Library of Alexandria was a loss, but the Library of Constantinople was so much bigger and was had so much more in it that in fact, most of the reason we have what we have is because it was in Constantinople, not Alexandria.
Right.
I don't know how true it is. There was some factoid going around the internet, which I always distrust implicitly, but saying that any time a ship pulled into Alexandria, if they had books on board, they would be confiscated, copied, and then returned because they would just be added to the library. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true, but that sounds like the kind of thing I wish it was true, even if it wasn't.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of respect for these things we ought to have.
This is what I'm going to get to.
Are you going to get to... Is this going to somehow come around to the burning of the Robert E. Lee statue? Have you seen about that?
No.
Oh, it's an example of what we're talking about.
But, here's what
and it's created a meme because basically there was footage of it because they bunch of...
twits.
No, it wasn't even a vandalism thing because the statue was taken down because of all the social garbage. It was given to a museum who then just destroyed it.
Which is...
And so there was actually footage of it happening, and it's like they cut it into pieces and they're melting it down. And so the thing that everyone's latched onto is there's a video of the head of Robert E. Lee in the fire, and people are like, this looks like an angry god because it's just this dark room, obviously because it's so bright, the fire is so bright, and all you see is this burning red face with this sort of sad look of disapproval. Someone made a meme of it and actually said they used that as the book cover of I forget what the author's name is, but they used that as the book cover of. There's a book called the Collapse of the American Empire. It's like it fits as that because it's like, yep, let's just destroy our history because it's inconvenient.
Well, and this is what Carlin gets to is that he basically says now with this modern technology of podcasting and whatever else, he goes, and this is the same guy that I was telling you about that was originally going to start his kind of journal or whatever, and he goes, what he's realized is the medium is so much more dynamic. He goes, this will outlive me. He said, all of this content I'm putting out will outlive me. And he goes, I don't know to what end.
As long as the internet exists.
Well, not just the internet, though, because people have archives of things.
Yeah.
It's like,
I mean, I do that. I actually have found stuff where I'm like, I'm going to keep this. Not even because I am personally like, wow, I love this. I'm just like, this is good. This is valuable.
But I mean,
this needs to be preserved.
This is what essentially he's saying is people that unpack the history, 300, 400 years from now, 500 years from now of our history are going to have a three-dimensional picture of what our society looks like.
It'll be very contradictory, though.
Well, it'll be
two parallel pictures,
complex and really muddy. But the point is,
we actually believe there were two completely separate universes in the past that collapsed somehow.
Well,
we found two fully 3D recreations of the entirety of North American history.
Well, true. I mean, like, for instance...
Probably more than two, let's be honest.
He gets into, like...
How many people are there? Well, that's how many universes there were.
This notion of if everybody on a lay level during the time of Alexander the Great was also putting out content that was...
They would have all been so ill-informed.
Well, sure, but see, that's the point.
I don't think we would actually know any more than we do.
This picture, because
most of them were dumb.
Sure,
not dumb.
But there's
rude.
also
they didn't have access to the correct information.
There was also a truth to the fact that the correct information, quote unquote, is going to be presented in a manner that most usefully paints the person who is communicating it. I mean, it's like that. There's, each person has their own angle at what something is supposed to be.
We know things we know unflattering things about Roman people because the idea that only the good stuff gets preserved because they would have destroyed the bad
good
stuff.
I'm saying
not always the case.
No. I'm not saying only the good stuff.
As societies become more historically minded, that becomes less and less the case.
Depending on, but see what he gets at, and
I actually think in our modern day, when quote unquote anyone can give their opinion, that's when truth gets more lost.
He gets to this because
not because of its absence, but because it's impossible to recognize.
Synthesizing the kind of cultural zeitgeist within the three-dimensional picture that we're going to get is a probably more accurate representation of a modern context than what we were able to give credit for in the past based on solely documentation and whatever else. Because you go, not only are you only dealing with scribes and educated people and things of that nature.
When it sound like an elitist, but perhaps those were the people best suited to do it.
Sure.
Because there's an element, I think, okay, if there was idiots like we have nowadays giving their opinion online and they were doing that with their own little scrolls in their back rooms, I don't think we'd be any better off. I actually think I've taken this in a bleak direction, but it's like there is the Orwellian versus Huxleyan view of censorship. It's like you either oppress the false or quote unquote the false narratives, the narratives you disagree with, so heavily that they aren't accessible, or you flood the market with so much drivel no one can tell what's true anymore.
Sure.
And in some ways, I would say in many ways Aldous Huxley was the more prescient of the two of those authors.
Sure.
Because his predictions as to how they would achieve things is closer to how they're trying.
Right.
And I just don't think that, like, I'm not sure. I was going to try to come up with a old-timey hickish name. I'm not sure what a Greek redneck's name would have been, but I don't think I want his opinion on Alexander the Great.
There's a famous French historian though that tried to kind of cohesively put all this history. I think it's called from
the cradle to
Persia,
the grave.
No, from Persia to what does he call it? From Cyrus to Alexander or something like that. And he's Brion, I think, is the historian. But one of the things he opens with, he says, so Dan Carlin is actually referencing this guy at one point, and he says he loves the fact that in this really, really comprehensive, very much trying to be true to the historical narrative throughout these historical periods, he opens his text by saying, he quotes a artist that basically says, if all of this history is not 100% true, you must believe it because it has the I'm gonna butcher the quote, but basically because it's worth believing in, kind of a thing. And what I'm getting at is, I thought
useful fiction kind of.
it is, but here's my point in that, because he was actually highlighting when I think it's Hippocrates who is it that's writing at the particular time that the Persians were.
I ain't got no clue. Thucydides, maybe?
Maybe it was Hippocrates, but anyway.
Thucydides is the only one I'm aware of. He wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. He might have been actually. He definitely wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. Whether he did it contemporarily or after the fact, I'm not sure, but Thucydides did write that.
I'll have to follow up on this discussion in the future.
Herodotus?
Herodotus, that's what
I
it
don't
was.
know that. I'm going to look. I have a look on my history shelf. I have a history of the Peloponnesian War, don't I? No, Herodotus wrote the histories, quote, just the histories. So,
anyway,
whereas Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, so...
no one, just hang
on. But anyway, what he was getting at was that even written down history, we're going to have things that are either over...
Things that they would have thought were not needing explanation.
Not even that.
Because there's examples of that, like the Egyptians had a close ally who we know about but have no clue where it is. Because all of the Egyptians would have been like, yeah, we know who the people of, I forget the name of it, but it's like, we know where this country is, so we don't write down, this is where they're located. It's like, yeah, we had trades with the people of this. And we're like, we have no clue who they are. We know that they existed. We just don't know where they are.
But then there's...
the internet may have died.
There's times that they will embellish for certain things. Hippocrates definitely is, and what he was getting at was history is not as black and white as I think a lot of people would like to consider it, especially antiquity. Well, it is, but this is where I was wanting to get into this discussion with you, because what he suggests is that in a modern context, history will become a little bit more...
It won't become any less muddled.
Transitory, maybe, is a good descriptor of it.
I'm not sure what you would mean by that.
Meaning it's fluid. It's not... When you are looking at the collective of all of these parts...
It was, by the way, Thucydides who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, so that was...
When you're looking at all of these various parts, you are trying to create a synthesis that, yes, is true to the original.
Exist.
Well, it's trying to be as true to the facts as you can, while also being compelling and telling it in the most, interesting manner you can as well. And so it's like there's going to be some colorful communication in how it's described. He actually uses the biblical narrative at times. Carlin does, and then at times uses, other, like for instance, I didn't realize that Cyrus the Great, Cyrus II within the biblical narrative obviously is credited as like, okay, he helped after the Babylonian exile, he helped restore, Jerusalem or whatever else. But it's a little bit downplayed, obviously so, because there's a greater narrative that the Bible's focused on. But what I didn't understand, especially as a biblical theologian, I thought this was fascinating, that Cyrus, on a broader level, both with the Assyrians and with the Persians and with even the Greeks, was a incredibly respected figure. Like, people, like, even within Greek culture were going, no, if you can do it like Cyrus, that would actually be really good.
There was a movement. There was movements in history of the successful empires became, this is what the thing Rome was famous for, was the successful empires would sort of conquer you, change the flag, and then mostly leave you alone. They were like, yeah, we're going to instill our own guy as like governor, but for the most part, your day-to-day lives aren't going to change. Sure. So that element of, because it used to be, all right, we're going to come in, we're going to slaughter everyone and put our own people.
That's certainly what the Assyrians did.
We're going to this whole town's going to be gone. It's going to be empty. We're going to move our own people in, and then it'll just be our town. Whereas the Romans were like, nah, you all can stay, but like this guy's in charge now, so like instead of that guy, pay your taxes to him. And other than that, go about your lives. And that was why people were like, well, okay, I guess being Roman's not so bad.
But I just found it fascinating that Cyrus was like to be called on a broad secular level, to be called among multiple various what is it called, kingdoms and empires, to be called Cyrus the Great is like, oh, okay, I didn't realize he was that prolific. But apparently the way he led, it was a little bit, I would liken him to like within that a contemporary within that time period to somebody like Ronald Reagan, where there was so many people that liked him on both sides of the aisle that it was a little bit like, what do we do with this guy? Because everybody loves him. It's like, because it was fascinating to as he was starting to unpack all this history and what he was getting at actually with the Persians and the Battle of Thermopylae and all that kind of stuff was that at this point the Persians coming in, although they have got a pretty negative connotation within that story, and obviously, you know, being that we are kind of the Greco-Roman society on a Western level. What? Yeah, there's a bit of that kind of culture, especially within our Western understanding, and so we go, well, they're just the bad Persians, but really historically,
Xerxes is a different character.
Sure, but I'm just saying, if you think about even within the biblical narrative, Persians were actually at times on the side of, or at least being used by.
Yeah, but even in the Bible, Xerxes is messed up.
Oh, 100%.
Xerxes is like, yeah, no, he was a whack.
Agreed.
And Darius came along and was like, no, we're going to be a little bit more sensible than that.
Well, and that's what he was getting at, was you have the Assyrians who when he started laying out the Assyrians empire and their rule, it was really like, ooh, now I kind of understand why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. It's a little bit like, yeah, those guys need to burn in hell. Like, because like he was talking about, what is it? The empire that they took over, and it's not going to come to me. It was the same empire that I was talking about that ended up merging with the Medes, but anyway, within that context, once the Persians kind of began to take over, people did not, yes, they had a problem with them being that they were conquering and things like that, but it wasn't the same as like the Assyrians. There was literally a guy that they came in and conquered this particular, it wasn't Babylon, but it was a similar kind of superpower. And they literally took the king's head, the Assyrians did, cut the king's head off. The king of Assyria took the guy's wife as like one of his concubines, and then literally put his head inside his royal like chambers, basically to just like stare for all eternity at his wife being a concubine to this other king. And it's a little bit like, to have that be a communication to, like, that's a way of communicating. It's almost like psychological.
It's Vlad the Impaler levels.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like he literally to have all these depictions of like all of their conquests and what happened to people who crossed the Assyrians, like as you're about to go meet the Assyrian king, just like, hey, guess what?
Well, that would work, of course.
It does, but it also garners a degree of hatred that, if you look both in the biblical narrative,
well, it's even the Machiavellian, where it's like, yeah, it would be better to be respected by your people, of course, because that will. That's the more tenable, but of course, fear is the most. It's impressive in the moment,
right? But that's kind of what. So then you have somebody like the Babylonians and then the Persians who led far less iron-fisted, maybe that they. So then, to watch this kind of thing go down, where the Spartan 300 just kind of going
up yours.
Yeah, we're not that scared of you. Like, come and take them. We'll just wait on you to do your thing. And anyway, I just was curious what your thoughts were.
It would actually be really funny. I would have just like because I mean, obviously we have several of the quotes that of like the King Leonidas to Xerxes, like some of those are actually historically documented, but I still think it would have been funny just to be like, send him one of the pottery depicting indecent things. Just be like, here, have a sodomy pot. This is our response to your plea for,
Well, it's like when the spy first went in, like the first one that Xerxes sent in is like, yeah, what are they doing? And make sure you're not seen. And he comes back and he's like, yeah, they saw me. They didn't even care I was there. They were just working out and brushing their hair. It's like,
see, I just feel like it would be funny. I don't know. I like when there's a little bit more of this, I don't know, perhaps wit, where I would just be like, send him the pot with the buggery and then just have a little note that says you're next or something.
You're next.
Because, I mean, as much as it's kind of like, all right, the whole come and take them or those, like, that's obviously its own kind of stone cold.
Well, that's still actually.
But I still think that there's an element of humor just to be like, here's a plaque depicting what's going to happen to you.
Well, I don't know if you knew this, but apparently Xerxes.
It would almost be like responding with a meme.
On his council, he had somebody who was formerly like a part of Sparta, and the guy literally said, "I told you what would happen when we came across these people initially, and you laughed at me, and now you're seeing it in the flesh." And he literally.
I think I know what the thumbnail for this is going to be. I'm just going to find one of the actual historical images of like, here's the pot depicting sodomy, and then just have it be like hastily scratched out, and then they've painted Xerxes' face on the other guy. Just be like, this is you.
Here's how you lose. No, I mean, it's not. It has to be noted that obviously the 300 were not by any means thinking that they were going to dominate that particular fight. I mean, it was.
No, it was a little bit of like we're gonna die
versus right.
We're gonna die.
Well, yeah. Well, and that's.
I don't know, but see, the thing about the Spartans saddens me. It's like they didn't actually last that long. So as much as you'd think, surely such a society would be like, how did they collapse? And it's like, well, it turns out that it's not a tenable way of forming a society, powerful as it is. So it's sad to me.
The way that...
Because there is a part of me where I'm just like, given the amount of work they put in, they should have continued forever. And yet that's just sort of the vagaries of history where it's like, well, the people who... Just because you worked hard doesn't mean you're going to win.
The silent period of the Assyrians actually is fascinating because there was a period in history where they kind of just fell off the map as far as any sort of historical documentation really anywhere. And... The way Dan Carlin deals with that, he goes, there's some historians that literally go, yeah, we don't know. And, all we know is that by the time we get out of this period, the Assyrians are utterly demolished at this point. And it's like, that's to watch them be at the utter crux of their superpowerness, if that makes sense. And then to watch them, because they were able to deal with like the steppe territories and these like groups that were literally coming in on horseback.
Well, the Mongols were their own thing.
Right, but I mean, think about the fact that they were arguably outmatched when it comes to the technology, if you want to call it that way. But Assyria had they had like literally, I think it was like 300,000, which was an absurd number within the fighting force. It would be like the equivalent of the U.S. today, where it's like there's not even a question who has the majority of it, and it's.
They were obviously more localized at that point because, like, Egypt was still around.
Sure,
Egypt would have been the closest thing to a superpower that era had. In terms of just raw untouchability, where it's like no one would even try.
Assyrians were fairly, because I mean, the steppe.
I don't know
cultures within the kind of their tribal.
The Mongols is who you're referring to.
Not just because there was another group of people.
The Mongolian Empire was pretty. The Mongols sacked Rome.
Right, but I mean, they also, as they came through, Egypt was affected. I mean, they certainly weren't. They weren't maybe overrun, but in the same way, the Assyrians also responded in kind, in that they were not defeated by any stretch, whereas somebody like the Babylonians and the Medes weren't quite as fortunate. It was like there was a time that the steppe people actually nearly overran the Medes altogether, and so it was a fascinating thing to, as he was kind of laying all this groundwork out, then to go looking back at the biblical narrative and watching as I believe it is the prophet. Which prophet is it that discusses Assyria, the fall of Assyria?
It was Jonah.
No, it's not coming to me. It's not Jonah. It's Wow, that's sad. I'll have to.
Was it Jeremiah or Ezekiel or?
No,
would have been one of those.
Minors. Anyway, but even within that time period, that Assyria was so despised that Persia and Babylon and it's like, sure, the Babylonian exile was terrible, but it was not,
where it's like being the vilest man is a great way to suddenly rise to power, but it will also be a great way to suddenly collapse.
I just thought it
because it's like because it turns out that the two next weakest empires together are stronger than you, and if they both hate you with a passion because you're so horrible, that you're just giving them reasons to team up.
So,
because again, this is why the Roman concept of like, yeah, we mostly just let people be.
Right.
So it's like, okay, yeah, we're fine with the Romans because they mostly just left us alone. Obviously, they didn't always, and so there were various, groups that eventually rebelled. But it's like, for the most part, reciprocity is the greatest way to ensure your dominion.
Obviously, Xerxes tried that with 300 because he was like, you guys can just be rulers and if you just lay down your arms. And that's when they responded with
the buggery pottery.
Buggery pottery.
So none of this jiggery pokery. None of this buggery pottery.
No, but I think I was curious about what your thoughts were on history again being a bit
What
more...
are those?
A bit more...
What are they called? Those...
Colorful.
Amphora? Is that what the Greek style of vase is called?
I do not know.
I think that's what they're called. Just the sodomy amphora. I want that in a museum. It's just yes, we call exhibition X12, commonly referred by scholars as the sodomy amphora. The response given by Leonidas to King Xerxes, just get bent in Greek.
Bent. I feel like that could have been translated.
That's almost what he said, but I mean, it would have been funnier had it been pictorialized. Just take one of those pots, take one of the porn pots, scratch out the face, paint Xerxes on there, and send it to him in the mail.
But no, just
he'll probably kill the messenger, so send someone you don't like.
That history is not. It's far more colorful because it's told by historians that are, yes, they're recording what happened, but they're also embellishing based on what they need to communicate. And it's a little bit of our discussion about the biblical narrative too, where it's like, do I think that the Bible has, archetypes and, again, throughout it, there's going to be some similarities in various other cultural histories and, whatever else. Sure. But of course, they're going to be crossover because it all was history. And all I'm saying is that no matter what book you're reading or historical account you're reading, it's going to be framed in a particular way in order to communicate something. Obviously, with the biblical narrative, it's a religious nature. But with with Hippocrates and there's one other historian that particularly covered the Assyrians and all that kind of stuff, that they were far more colorful in their language, which actually Carlin actually touches on the fact that this actually demonstrates why the biblical narrative was more than likely written in the Babylonian period, is because it's like a lot of
which of them though, because I have heard, I'm not swayed by that when it comes to the Torah.
No, the Torah.
There are those who say that like all of it was written.
No. I'm not somebody who ascribes to that particularly. No, the Torah. I think because
obviously some of it is like factually, like we know most of the prophets wrote during the exile.
Correct.
Most of them are writing about the exile.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. But it's if you look at the prophets,
you're talking about like the books of Chronicles and those things where it's like, yes, they weren't written at the time they were written.
Correct.
Well,
they're
some
written
of them though, because they obviously like the entire book of Kings refers to, or is it not? Every chapter ends with, and for the other elements of his reign, are they not written in the book of whatever? So it's like there was probably an official court book that was like, all right, here's the day-to-day happenings. But that wasn't what was read because it wasn't very interesting.
Correct, and they're ascribing, they're
Kings or the Book of Kings is like, here's all the big stuff, and then everything else, it's like, yeah, it's in the court documents.
Added it, right, exactly.
If you want to go look at them.
Right. So, I mean, it would be the same, it would be equivalent as like somebody taking a encyclopedia and trying to like, okay,
well, even that's exactly what encyclopedias do, where it's like, here's the rundown, here's some books to look at if you really want the details, but here's just sort of, here's like, a couple paragraphs synopsizing the whole topic.
And that's essentially what happened. But I just thought that an interesting notion, and I didn't know how you specifically
I'm fine. I mean, history is.
You seem.
I wish I knew more of it than I do, because it's crazy. It's huge and it's impossible to.
Well, it's huge, but it's all. That's the thing I was getting at. It's impossible to actually nail down what is true and what isn't within the content. Well, and forgive me for being sophist again.
No, because that's more of an element of the records simply don't exist to be certain.
Well, and that's the thing.
That's just the fact. It's like, well, yeah, that's always going to be the case about things that long ago.
Well, and that's all I was getting at, is that faith is required no matter what.
Well, that's just true in everything boils down to some metaphysical assumption you made somewhere.
Right. But I did find it funny that within the, first of all, twofold. When I was watching through this, and I'll send it to you. It's literally called King of Kings and we'll post it if that's of any consequence.
Don't go giving me homework.
But, well, I mean, it's not that big a deal. You're going to put a sodomy pot on the front, so you got to find that, too. You might
Potomy.
Oh, my.
Solder potomy.
Anyway, but no.
Buggery pottery sounds funny. Because it sounds like an old British, like, poppycock, or it's just, that's just buggery pottery.
I don't think that would have been Xerxes' response.
He opens it up going, what are you showing me?
Xerxes pops out from
not for none, but for a minute I thought it was a tiny person.
I thought it was buggery pottery. But no, it's called King of Kings. But the two things that I found most fascinating is the Assyrians were far more prolific in their day than I gave them credit for. In reading the biblical narrative only.
Well, they held their area, but they didn't hold a lot of land. I thought they basically held what is modern day like Syria and that kind of Middle Eastern bloc. But they never they weren't the Romans in grade of they spread everywhere.
I mean, they were
but I'm saying they held that fervently, but they didn't expand as far as I'm aware. Because generally, expansion is what tends to get you historical points.
Sure.
That's why Alexander the Great, literally, it all fell apart when he died. It was like, this span of land he held for 30 years total. Right. And then it all went away. But people know about him because it was a lot of land, not because he held it for a long time.
Sure. I think it was...
So the Assyrians, it's they've held that land forever, but it's just that land.
It may have been more just with the gravitas that Assyria led with.
I have heard the sort of the fact that they were basically some of the most. I mean, they were not even. It's like people thought the Huns were bad, and it's like no.
No, the Assyrians were jacked up. Well, it's like what they did was not just that's there was an account where they made the sons of this father grind basically turn to dust their father's remains. Essentially, it's like, no, that's a degree of psychological torture.
Yeah, but that was part and parcel. We're just going, you must be subjugated by all means possible.
And I think the other thing is the brutality in which the Assyrians approached things by contrast to how Cyrus the Great was perceived, I thought was fascinating. I mean, just that there was such a respect across the board. Again, even to the societies.
You find that a lot in history where it's yes, we're adversaries, but he's all right. I like him. They talk again. This was in the video on Byzantium, where it's a lot of the emperors had good relations with. I forget because there was an Arab empire that constantly was sort of being conquered by other Arab empires. But even then, it's like, all right, yeah, you've kind of stolen some of my land, so like we're gonna have to dispute about that. For the most part, it's like I think yeah, we get together sometimes. He's all right. And there was one there was funny examples of banter where I think it was at one point the Byzantines were fighting off, I forget who, but it was on the west side. And they eventually managed to like suppress this rebellion, regain the territory, and then the Arab guy sends a message to the emperor being like, "Oh, congratulations on, reconquering this land. I hope to see some sort of thanks for my part in that, given that you wouldn't have been able to do it if I had been attacking you at the same time." It's like the fact that our border was secure is why you were able to do that. So he's teasing me like, "Hey, where's my cut?"
Yeah.
It's like that's just good old fashioned like ribbing. That's full on just we might be enemy states, but we're all right with each other.
Well, I mean, it also underscores that on a historical account, many of these empires, because of dynastic marriages and things of that nature, had I mean, they more than likely were either second, like it's like first cousins, sometimes very much fighting together. It was, it's like, or even to the degree of
I'm not sure that there was that level of intermixing then.
Well, maybe third cousins constantly fighting, but still.
Because I mean, you actually the family lines of like the First World War are stupid because it's like literally this is just one horrific family conflict. There's even a joke by, I forget which of them, but one of the leaders who was, because obviously most of them drew some amount of either direct lineage or its close lineage to Queen Victoria. And so literally one of the leaders of some country basically said, "I suspect that if grandmother had been alive, she would never have allowed it." Because they're literally going like, "Yeah, I'm fighting with my second cousin against my third cousin." And it's like that was when, because it's through diplomacy that intermarriage happens, not just out and out war.
No, exactly.
So the idea that like the king of Assyria would have had any relations with anyone else, I'm like, he probably wouldn't have spared them. He would have been like, "No, I'm going to kill you and your wife."
Assyria, certainly, yeah.
So it wouldn't have been like, "Oh, send your princess to appease the man." He'd be like, "No, they'll probably just kill her or do something worse,
or put its head in a pickle jar,
or kill you and put your head,
put its head in a pickle jar and then make you watch as I used your wife."
So
that's just disturbing. I don't know. There's something about that to me that was just like, ew. I don't like that. Like, I mean, there's psychological proof that like you're powerful, and there's another one that's as the wife, that just would be an awkward.
That comes to a matter of that's some form of sadistic pleasure on your part. Because it's one thing to be like, "All right, I'm going to put my enemies on pikes at the door so everyone knows like this is what will happen to you." But if it's just like, I'm going to keep his bones in my room so I can look at them and be like, "Ha ha," you're getting some kind of a kick out of that you shouldn't.
That's exactly.
You're going to look at my buggery pottery.
Anyway, but you should listen to him.
Put your bones in the buggery pot.
He's good. I'm going to continue listening to him. I'm only got, I think, about 2/3 of the way through the first session, but there's 3, and I'm like, and all of it has to do with
I got plenty of time with my work, so I mean, I'd probably be perfectly suited for those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think now it's actually a subscription-based thing. He's moved away from YouTube.
Well, I mean, fair enough, but that's sad. So is the Lotus Eaters.
Most of his stuff is on there still. He's got, but again, like I said, most of it's literally like 4 hours long, so it's not at all a passing fancy. You have to be a serious history buff to be like, "Yeah, I want to listen to this."
Or just sit at a desk all day.
Or if you're just, have some sort of sadistic pleasure.
What else am I going to listen
to? Pickle jars.
Going to listen to music for 5 hours? That's going to get boring real quick.
So.
All right, that's it.
We're gonna find the buggery pot now.
There it is.